So now we have our first Rmarkdown document and the result of compiling it into a report, in this case an HTML document. So to better understand how an Rmarkdown document creates the final report, we're going to start from scratch and see what happens along the way. I'm actually going to delete everything except for the header. So the header, we can see, is some sort of meta information about this. It creates a title, the author, the date, and in this case, when using the knit button, we are knitting to HTML. We could actually change this to various formats, including PDF and Word, but we're mostly going to stick with HTML. Okay, so Markdown is just sort of a shorthand language for producing HTML, but also other formats. But you can sort of think of it as a shorthand notation for HTML. So we can use hashtags or pound signs to create headers. So here's header 1, I'll create another header here. We can also do subheaders by adding additional hashtags or pound signs. Let's see, we'll call this a subheader. And let's just put some text here to sort of get a better idea of what the spacing will look like. And we'll knit this, and we see the resulting headers, a subheader which is slightly smaller than the overall header, and the text interspersed. So I'm going to create some more text, but now let's try to stylize some text. So for example, we could write bold text. We could also write, let's see, italic text. If we knit that, we see the resulting bold and italic text. So bold is created with 2 stars on each side, italic with 1. Another useful thing, because we'll be talking about code very often, is the ability to have monospace font. So here we see a monospace font. That, and see what happens. We see it, it sort of is output stylized as code, so that'll be useful. So another useful thing to be able to do is write lists. We'll do that fairly frequently. So it's a single dash and then a list element. There's a spelling button here in case I screwed up. Oh, I did. Okay, and then I'm just going to copy and paste this a few times to get a list going, and we see lists. Another useful thing to do is to be able to link. So links look like this. So here we have the text of the link. So let's say we could link to Google. And then I need to put the actual link address here, www.google.com. Let's see, what are some other useful links? So here's a useful web page here, which is the Rmarkdown web page from our studio. There's a number of resources you might want to be aware of here. This Getting Started link here has a number of tutorials for getting started with Rmarkdown. I'm just interested in the link right now because I just needed another link to talk about. So here we'll say Rmarkdown documentation and the link here. So if we knit this, if I click the button, we see some links here. I should probably space them appropriately. Maybe I could put them as a list. And now we have a list of useful links here. Okay, so one thing that'll come up often is creating tables inside of Rmarkdown. The syntax for this is a little tricky. So one thing that I often do, I'll use a Markdown table generator, which you can generally find by just searching for one in Google. I have a 3x3 table here. Just to show you, I have a 3x3 table. Let's see, A, B, C, 1, 2, 3, do, was it Ray, me? I think that's right. So if I generate this table, I can copy this text and then place it into my document here and knit that. And we see the resulting table in the output. So at this point, we've only done Markdown. So everything here is Markdown, and this is a quick way to express what we want to see in the resulting HTML. But now the power of Rmarkdown will be the ability to, as you guessed, introduce R. So to do so, we want to insert what's called an R chunk. So let's see if I remember how to do this. Code, insert chunk. But this is something you're going to do so often, you'll absolutely want to remember the keyboard shortcut, which for Windows happens to be Control-Alt-I. So I'll do that here. So now we see by using this shortcut we have this syntax here. This essentially says anything between here and here will be R code. So let's just sort of maybe create a couple vectors. I'll create a vector of X, and maybe I'll create Y, which is based on X. We'll make it 3 times X. And now when I knit this, we see the result here, which is to show the error code, but I realized that nothing was output here, so I didn't give you an example of output. So maybe we'll add something like X plus Y. So I think this in the end should be 4 times X. And we see now the output as well as the code. Let's create a few more chunks. So I'll do another one here. Maybe this one I will want to plot, no, let's create a histogram of y. Let's see what happens when we do that. Okay, and it results in a histogram of y as well as the code used to generate this. And I'll make just one more chunk. Let's see, maybe create some more data here. We'll call it z. Just give it some sort of arbitrary data here. And then maybe return z plus x. So we might notice a lot of these chunks depend on previous chunks. So we see here that, oh, I made z and x of different lengths, and I'm sort of getting a warning here. So first let's deal with this. Sometimes we don't want to see warnings like this. So now we can talk about chunk options. So for example, sometimes maybe we don't want to see the code that displays this histogram here. So what I can do is say echo equals false. Similarly, maybe I don't want to see this warning. And we can sort of see here, there's these buttons off to the side here. I'm going to click this one, which is a setting. So for this particular chunk, I'm going to say I don't want to see warnings and I don't want to see messages. And actually, I'm going to come back to this chunk here too and say, maybe I want this histogram to be bigger. I don't really want it to be bigger, but for the sake of example, let's maybe make it rather large. And we see that I've now modified some more chunk options here. And if we knit, we see that now the histogram is gigantic and no longer is the code that generated this plot being displayed. And lastly, the warning message about z and x not being of the same length has suddenly disappeared. I'd also note that, well, all this code here depends on x. So, or at least all the code depends on this chunk here. Back when I first started generating analyses, you'd have to run your R code, sort of copy and paste your code to another document, and then copy and paste the output into the document, and then, gosh, if something changed, you have to go through the whole process again. But here, and this is going to seem sort of trivial now, but I could, for example, just change this to be maybe a longer vector, rerun my code, and everything is totally fine. So you might be thinking, well, we just created a bunch of extra work for ourselves because now every time we want to see what's happening here, we have to click knit and then find it in the resulting document and see what happens. But that's not actually the case. These buttons over here are sort of indicating, hey, wait, we can actually run this code. So I can run this chunk with the play button here, and we see it runs and outputs directly in line inside of the Markdown document. We could also use our usual Control-Enter for running a chunk. I also believe we could use Control-Shift-Enter for running an entire chunk instead of just one line. So now this is going to get annoying with this being so big. Let's change it. So now with the ability to both run inline and then knit a final document, we see that Rmarkdown is a really nice way to work on an analysis. So before we had seen that our environment was not being used at all, but now by working inline, our environment is being populated with what we're doing inline. So we should also be able to import data in analysis like this, so let's do that real fast. We'll import from a CSV file. I believe I actually happen to slip some data into this folder that we've been working on. We'll do input. Yep, that looks good. We'll import that. And now if I go back to my Markdown file, I can do things like, let's say, example underscore data, $y, just y. Maybe I'll take the mean of that. Actually, that wouldn't make sense because that's a numeric variable, not a numeric variable. So we'll just do this, and we'll knit it. And we have a problem here because while example data is inside of my global environment for working interactively, there's no instruction inside this document for where to obtain that data for where I'm knitting. So I need to be sure to include a chunk that actually reads in the data. So I'll steal this code here. I'll remove this information that I don't need. I'll change this just because I want to. And now we'll knit this. We'll see that now the document runs. So now we could be both running interactively and we'll have the ability to knit to a final file. I will note a couple things. We don't necessarily want to see this, so again we could modify our chunk options here. No warnings, no messages. I believe this is a message, not a warning. And I'll also note that while this works, this will only work on my machine or any machine where the data is in this exact directory. So I would prefer to use a relative reference. So this means that we want the data file to be in the same directory as the RMD, and this will still knit because that is the case. You'll also note that if you're working interactively, your working directory is automatically the directory that contains the RMD file. So if I wanted to just import the data without having to use the import dataset button, I'll put a quote here, tab complete, and these are the files in the same directory as this file. So here's the data I want. I knit, and everything sort of works out. So in general, you just need to be aware of, am I working interactively or am I knitting? When I'm knitting, everything has to just read in order from the top to bottom of your RMD file. When you're working interactively, things are being affected by the global environment here. So note that, for example, things can be run out of order now. So I could, for example, continue to run this chunk here, and actually let's do this. We'll say now that maybe we'll get a little crazy here. Say that y is equal to x here, and this will continue to change my working environment the entire time. This would not knit because when it gets to this line, it'll say that it doesn't know where y is, so it doesn't work, so I'll have to return to what we had originally. But you just always need to be aware of, am I working interactively or am I knitting a final document? If you're knitting, you need to be able to run from top to bottom. If you're running interactively, you're operating inside your global environment.